All right, welcome back, listener. This is Josh, j.c.l, and today I have a very special guest on The Writer's Lens. He is a speaker and author of the national bestseller Called to Create. He is a self-described serial entrepreneur, which I will look forward to unpacking that with him a little bit later. He is the executive chairman of Threshold 360, a venture-backed tech startup that has built the world's largest library of 360-degree experiences of hotels, restaurants, and attractions. He's spoken at Harvard University, South by Southwest, and TEDx. And twice he's been selected as a Google Fellow. And if that's not enough, he has had the honor of serving in the White House under President George W. Bush. Did I mention anything that I shouldn't have, Jordan? How are you,
No,
sir?
it's fine. I mean, I don't know. The Bush thing might get me in trouble with some listeners, but hey,
It's all
it's
good.
the White House, so who cares?
Exactly. Well, Jordan, thanks so much for connecting with me here on the Writer's
Yeah.
Lens.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Josh.
Your book Called to Create, I read
Yeah.
a little over a year ago now,
Okay.
and really enjoyed it. Great read, talking about the ins and whys of how to create, and it was just awesome. And I've talked about you quite a bit actually on this podcast, so this is a bit of a surreal experience for me. So very cool of you to
This
take
will
some
be
time.
fun.
Yeah.
I'm excited. I'm
Yeah.
excited. I was telling somebody the other day. I'm like, it's actually pretty rare that I talk about the process of writing. Like, this actually is probably the first show I've done where that's kind of the main subject matter. So this will be like cathartic for me. This will be educational for me, if nothing else.
Excellent. We'll roll out the couch for you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So, with all that being said, then, I really enjoyed your book, and it's all about learning how to innovate and create. But as far as the process, let's get into Jordan himself. What is your story? I mentioned a lot of things that you've been doing, what you've been up to,
Yeah.
and what led up to eventually writing this book. So, who is Jordan Raynor, and how did you get to where you are today with this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It sets up some context for why I'm, writing nonfiction, actually writing nonfiction full time as of 2.5 months ago. We just announced my deal with Random House for a new book that comes out in January 2020, another full-length nonfiction book called Master of One. And actually, that's a good setup for the whole conversation. But let me backtrack about 10 years. So I've spent my entire career as a serial entrepreneur. Basically, all that means is I really love starting companies and getting them to a place where they can live without me and then leaving to go start something else, right? Which fortunately for me, I realized a few years ago, that's essentially what publishing is, right? I mean, but with publishing, the beauty of publishing is you have one thing that you're continually getting good at over time, which is writing. But every book is a product launch, right? Every book is essentially a new venture, I would argue, right? I mean, a lot of times you're positioning it for a slightly different market, right? You got to identify who that market is, bring a product that meets the needs of that market to bear. So I don't know. It's a very interesting process. But historically, when I say I'm an entrepreneur, it's been mostly tech startups. So my first couple of companies were in the political and government markets. Politics was kind of my first love, hence my experience at the White House. So started and sold a few ventures there. And, about 5 years ago, I was I personally, so I'm a Christian. I'm a believer in what the scripture says of who Jesus Christ is. I know it's something you and I share, Josh. And about 5 years ago, I was exiting a venture. I was considering starting another one. I was pretty sure I was going to start another company. Mm-hmm. And I went to this event that was calling for church planters to go across the United States and plant churches in cities. And I'm sitting there in the audience and I'm listening to them describe like who's the ideal church planter. Mm-hmm. And this guy's like describing entrepreneurs. I'm like, oh my word. By the way, if you're curious, if you're really interested about the parallels between like startup life and church planting, there's a fantastic little podcast series that Gimlet produced a while back on church planting. On their startup podcast. It's excellent. It's really, really good. Produced by this guy named Eric Mennel. I was really impressed by it. And anyways, so I'm sitting there. I'm like, oh, maybe I should plant a church. And I started talking to some friends about it and, some guys that were much more experienced than me and kind of further along in life. And their feedback was kind of overwhelmingly similar. It was like, hey, like you are gifted. You're clearly passionate about entrepreneurship. You're clearly gifted at the craft. You've created a lot of value, a lot of jobs. Why do you think you should go take those skills and apply it to something else. That doesn't make any sense. Like, don't you understand? And these are people who shared my faith. Like, don't you understand that entrepreneurship can be a means of living out your faith and loving your neighbor as yourself? You love your neighbor as yourself when you create great products and, whatever. I was like, I don't understand this at all. So I went out and I just started interviewing people. I started doing firsthand interviews with other Christian entrepreneurs that I knew, but also doing my own research. So I studied up on people like Arthur Guinness of the Guinness Brewing Company. A lot of people don't know that Arthur Guinness was a devout Christian,
I would argue
one of the more successful ones of all time. People like the founders of In-N-Out Burger down in Southern California, and Chick-fil-A and True Cathy. So doing my own research on these guys, and as I started kind of filling up a moleskin with notes from all this research and all these interviews, I was like, this is a book, right? It was very much like a collection phase of just collecting all these stories, and I don't know, started making the creative connections between them and realized like this is an interesting book. So I eventually turned that into my first traditionally published full-length nonfiction book. I had self-published 2 books prior to that, but released Called to Create in November of 2017. That book did very well. Actually continues to do very well. We keep selling that thing.
Congratulations, man.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a really, really fun project. And so right at the time I finished writing Called to Create, so you writers probably know traditional publishing world takes forever. So I finished writing it in like August, September of 2016. The book wasn't going to be out for another year. And right after I got done writing it, I got recruited by the board of directors to run this venture-backed tech startup here in Tampa, where I'm from, called Threshold 360. And I said no a few times and eventually said yes, just because I was like really excited about what these guys were doing. And so I ran that venture for 2.5 years up until almost 3 months ago, when we recruited somebody, frankly, more qualified than me to run the company and take it to the next level. And so that was part one. But part two was, I really wanted to sink my teeth into my career as a writer. I'd signed this deal with Random House, and I just knew that in order to do this really, really well, in order to do this most exceptionally well, I needed to dedicate pretty much all of my time and energy and focus to it. And I had a unique opportunity to do that. Most writers never get that. Most writers will always be writing a book on the side while they make money doing something else. And I've been fortunate enough, by no merit of my own, I legitimately believe by the grace of God alone, to be able to do this work full time. So as of 3 months ago, I decided, let's put all my eggs in this basket and take a risk and, see what happens. So that's what I'm doing now. That's why I have time in the middle of the day to record podcasts like this now.
Exactly. That's awesome. That's an awesome story, Jordan. Now, as far as the serial entrepreneur, as far as how you kind of self-described you, many people, I think, have a bit of a misconception about what entrepreneurialism actually looks like. Some people think it's like, well, you have a ton of time or you have no time. So is it more about like balancing different things? And, like as far as when you were going to write the book, obviously you took a ton of time to do that. But as far as this entrepreneurial aspect of it, what does that actually look like? How do you live that out?
So, I mean, I think entrepreneur is a term that we throw around a lot, right? It's a very sexy term in our culture today. I think maybe the only thing more attractive in our culture than being an entrepreneur is being an author.
And you get to claim to be both. So there you go.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I think a lot of the traditional definitions of the word leave a lot to be desired. So actually in Call to Create, I somewhat audaciously proposed a new definition for the word entrepreneur as anybody who takes a risk to create something new for the good of others, right? And I think when you take that definition, I think authors certainly qualify as entrepreneurs. Authors are risking reputation, credibility, risking time, risking resources all the time to bring about new things. But they're not doing it for themselves, right? I would argue you're not really an author if you just write a book and keep your manuscript on a shelf. Real artists ship, real entrepreneurs, real authors ship, right? And we do that for the good of others. We do it to share our creations with others, and obviously to make money while doing it, right? And so, but I like describing authors as entrepreneurs, because one thing I found in going through the process of getting 2 traditional publishing deals now is the best authors identify as entrepreneurs. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard from publishers in interviews when they've been considering making offers on my books, how much they appreciate that I think like an entrepreneur. Like I think I'm a good writer, but there are tons of good writers and many writers that are better than me writing nonfiction today, right? But I think one thing that makes me unique in the market and makes me uniquely valuable in the market is that I'm not just a good writer, but I'm first and foremost an entrepreneur. I think in terms of markets and market size, right? And how to position a product for that market, right? So I think very much like a product manager almost, right? And I think in order to be a really successful author in nonfiction or fiction today, you've got to think like that. Like that is how you win.
Social media has enabled us to do that. I mean, you said you self-published your first 2 books, and I mean, I've self-published, and you do have to think, okay, I'm not thinking in terms of 30 days, I'm thinking 90 days, 120 days beyond that. I'm not just thinking what's right in front of my face. Okay, I have to have a launch period, I have to have some build up, I have to have a platform built, I have to have people invested to share my material. If I'm going to be self-publishing, there's a whole gamut of things that you have to be on top of in order to be successful at that launch. So yeah, I totally resonate with what you're saying, Jordan. So yeah. I'm sorry, did you have anything else you wanted to add to that?
No.
Okay. Good. So as far as that narrative then that's around, the book writing process, I mean, for you, so this was like you were saying, this is, a collection of interviews that you made and everything, and you thought, okay, this is a pretty good idea. I can put this down on paper. And as far as being able to share it with other people, was there any kind of like part of this where you went, this is too hard, like I don't know if I'm ever going to be able to finish this thing? Like, what was that process like? Because I know that many writers and authors face this. They face this fear of not just rejection, which I think is just universal, but this fear of, I'm never going to actually finish this thing. It's just too daunting. It's too big.
Man, yeah, I'll be honest, not really. I'll say this with never a fear that I wouldn't finish it, right? I will say Master of One was way harder to write than Called to Create for reasons that I can explain. But yeah, never a sense that it wasn't gonna get done. And I think a lot of that is just due to the fact that like prior to writing those books, I've had a lot of experience just accomplishing very big things and using really good project management methodologies to do so. So I'm a huge believer in David Allen's getting things done methodology. I tell any young person, if you master the GTD workflow, you will be exceptional. Truly exceptional compared to anyone else that you compete with in any line of work. Like it is the silver bullet for being remarkable as a person and as a professional, right? And there's lots of time management books, but I found that GTD is by far the most it's life changing. It's rewiring your brain and how you think to make sure that you're capturing all of your actions and playing your time really well and planning your projects really well. So because of that, I don't feel like I ever got to this place of like, oh, I'm not going to finish this book. That said, like I alluded to before, Master One was way harder to write. And I'm thinking a lot about why. And I really think it came down to the fact that, with Called to Create, when I was writing Called to Create, I was running my own consulting business. I could basically work on the book and think about the book whenever I wanted to, right? It was just, I could take long walks in downtown Tampa where I work and make creative connections between ideas. But with Master of One, I started writing it when I was working, 80 hours a week or whatever it was, running this tech startup that had millions of dollars invested in it. We had 50 whatever contractors and employees. Like it was just impossible. There was no mental bandwidth to make creative connections between ideas. That made it really, really hard. Really hard. Like I think as a writer, you've got to have plenty of white space mentally to be able to make those really creative connections, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, right? Like solitude and silence and just long walks are like really critical to that process. And somehow though, I actually think Master of One's going to end up being a better book, but I honestly don't know how. Like I can't take credit for that because I really did feel through the process like, man, this is a lot harder just because I didn't have that white space.
Do you think there was any kind of added expectation as well? Maybe like coming off of Call to Create? Totally?
Yeah. Totally. Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, it's the fear of the sophomore slump. And it's also like there's a lot more pressure because, I was with a bigger publisher. It was a bigger deal. It was a much bigger advance. So there's a lot of pressure that comes with that. And frankly, I think a lot of that pressure is good, right? Like I had so many I've been overwhelmed at the impact that Call to Create has had in people's lives. Like truly overwhelmed. Like people like you that have these great podcasts, that have these great careers coming to me and saying, hey, like I highlighted the heck out of this book is incredible to hear. And so you get to this place where you just really don't want to let your readers down, right? Like you don't want to disappoint your readers when you have this first, and I really consider it's not the first book, it's the first traditionally published book, but when you have this first book for the majority of your readers, it's the first book of yours that they've read, and you've set the bar so high, there's tremendous pressure on like how in the world are we gonna clear this? And also the tendency to just be like real with yourself and being honest about, is this better than the last one? You don't want to market it as such if it's not such. But I legitimately believe it's a better book. I think it's a bigger, more difficult idea that I wrote about in Master of One. I think it's a more controversial idea, which I think will make it more fun. Like I think the people who love Master of One are going to be obsessed with Master of One, and the people who hate it are going to loathe it and will never read anything else I ever write. But hey, I mean, whatever. It'll be a lot of fun.
Awesome. So you've drawn in this massive audience, and now you're going to polarize them with the release of this other book.
That's exactly what we're going to do. Yeah.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. I thought it was interesting what you mentioned about project management and having a good handle on that, because I think there's a lot of authors and writers that think of writing as very, on a whim. Like inspiration just comes over me and I just do it. And it's not so much that the goal is the most important thing, but rather the process is the most important part of that. Now, I know that you're writing nonfiction primarily, and I know that fiction and nonfiction folks I've talked to kind of deal with this in some way. But would that be? I mean, you kind of already made an endorsement for this, but would you endorse to any writer, any kind of new author, look, learn how to prioritize your days, project management, all kinds of things like that? I mean,
I think it's like critical. Like when I hear authors telling me like, I think this is common for authors that just sit around and wait for inspiration and then write. No wonder it takes you 5 years to finish a book. Like that's I have this friend of mine who he's a better writer than me. He's a fantastic writer, but he's an admitted procrastinator, right? So he had a book deal around the same time I did. And he waited until like the last 2 months to write this thing, and he had to end up like going away from his family for like 6 weeks to like lock himself in a room and like get it done. And I'm like, that's one way to do it. But I think if you're following, one of the things I love about I'm going to harp on GTD. I'm like the biggest evangelist for getting things done by David Allen. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest things that David Allen preaches is this idea of taking really, really, really big projects and breaking them down into much smaller bites, much smaller next actions. You can't do a project, right? Like a project, so for a writer, a project is finish the manuscript for Master of One. You can't visualize that. That's not something tangible and actionable that you can actually go do right now. What I can do is I can sit down and make an outline for chapter one, right? Like that is highly practical, highly actionable, and something that I could probably do in my next 90-minute block, right? That I sit down and execute, right? So I think it's like critically important for writers to really get that. That said, I do think there's a place for I think all writers feel this. There are certain times in which we are more inspired than others, right? And so while I think it's important to be disciplined and to write every single day, and I think it's even helpful to write at the same time every single day, whether or not you feel inspired,
No, I agree with
I
that.
do think there's a lot of room for when you do feel inspiration to write until you don't. Like just write as much as you possibly can because those moments are totally magical, for lack of a better word. Like I don't know a better way to describe it. Like it's just I mean you get it, you're a writer. Like I don't know how to explain that. Like you I think it's unwise to like not capitalize on that, right? If you have the time to do it and you sense inspiration, yeah, sit down and write like crazy, but don't let that be the only time that you write. Otherwise, you're not going to really have a lot of control over the,
Right.
you know, timeline in which that book's gonna kind of come to fruition.
No, for sure
Yeah,
not. I mean, I think
yeah,
it's interesting. I'm sure you're familiar with maybe Jerry Jenkins' work, the Guild, his Writers Guild. Have you ever heard of that?
yeah, yeah.
Familiar with? Yeah, yeah. I mean, I remember listening to him a long time ago. How he said that he would not write when between the hours of when his family was awake. He would only write after hours
Interesting.
until his first book was done.
Yeah,
And that was how he prioritized himself because he knew that was when he would be kind of like his mind would be set.
yeah.
So he wouldn't have to be, okay, I got to be husband right now, I got to be
Right,
dad right now, or
right.
friend, brother, whatever. This would just be time when everyone's asleep, everyone's in bed, and now I can just focus on what I'm doing. And honestly, I think that's a good way to start it. And I think a lot of writers don't really start out that way. They just kind of go, oh, I have the next 30 minutes.
Right, right, right,
I'm gonna sit down and crank something out. I'm gonna make
right,
sure,
right, right.
and it might
I
start
also
that
think,
way.
sorry, I'm going to take this on a couple different rabbit trails. The other thing too is like I think a lot of writers, I see this a lot in nonfiction, right? A lot of writers just sit down and start writing in prose and full length, paragraphs, and I think it's a huge mistake, right? C.s. Lewis, who is one of my all-time favorite authors, had a very simple process that he executed when he was writing. He used to say all the time, he's like, know exactly what you want to say, right? Number two, say it, and then number three, say it well, right? But the first step is knowing what in the world you want to say. And so I think a lot of writers, when they think about writing, they think that writing is actually sitting down and writing in full paragraphs. I would argue that outlining and getting clear on what you want to say is 85% of the energy of writing. Not probably not the time, but it's at least 50% of my time writing. When I'll take Master of One as an example. When I was writing Master of One, I mean, there's months and months of just reading and collecting ideas and doing interviews and getting all the pieces of the puzzle in the box, right? But then the real work of writing is in taking those puzzle pieces, making creative connections between them, and then outlining exactly what you want to say. And I always tell writers, when I know when I am ready to actually get out of an Evernote outline and get into a Google Doc and start writing, when my outlines are so detailed that I just naturally am writing in full sentences, right? But until then, you got to be able to read an outline. I use this test a lot. Like I'll give this to a member of my team, or I'll give it to my wife. I'll give my wife the outline, or my friend an outline, and say, hey, do you get what I'm trying to say in this chapter? Is it crystal clear? Is the argument really solid, right? And if not, like I'm not ready to open up a Google Doc yet. That's kind of the criteria I use.
That's awesome. To that point, then, as far as having a team, I mean, how many
Yeah.
people does it take to go into getting a good launch on a book? I mean, because
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh man. Literally hundreds. Like I actually believe that. Not like full-time staff, obviously. I don't have a payroll of
Right.
$10 million annually.
I'm not gonna throw out some advertisements for people who want to join my launch team.
Right.
Soon.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. No, but I mean, I've actually been thinking a lot about this over the last week. I've got a call with the team at Random House that's managing Master of One tomorrow, and I've been prepping for that. And it is literally hundreds of people. I mean, I think between you get your launch team, obviously, which people place some arbitrary caps on the number of people on a launch team, which I think is like so silly. Like cap it based on criteria, right? If you got people who are fired up and have more than a dozen people to share your book with, they should be on your launch team. Like I think it's like so silly to cap those things. But Yeah, so I mean, it's the launch team, it's the endorsers, and I think like really taking the time to cultivate those relationships is really, really, really
Right.
critical, right? It's not something that you can do a month before the book drops. Like I'm doing it, I have been doing it for a couple of months now, and my book doesn't come out for another 8 months, 9 months, 8 months, something like that, right? So being methodical early on about that is like really, really important. But when I say my team, I mean I've got a couple of people. So right now, my team is a couple of part-time people. That's it, right? They're contractors. They're not W-2 employees. So I mean, my team as an author is like pretty lean, especially compared to teams that I've had in companies that I've run before. But the larger team is literally hundreds of people.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I was talking to a gentleman, Austin Goen, who just published a book back in March, and he had over 100 people that he was kind of depending upon as far as helping share his book launch
Yeah.
after it was
Yeah.
done. And I just went, that's awesome. That's great. As far as, because that's what's going to take, to get the word out, because it's not just this process of, you've built something, because books are a little bit more organic in a sense
Yeah. Oh,
of,
totally. Very,
ideas.
very social products. Yeah.
Yeah, very social products. The ideas are like,
Yeah.
almost like sticky paper.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like they
Sure.
get stuck to someone, and then I want to share it with somebody else. It gets stuck to them.
Yeah.
So I think there definitely is a process, like you're saying, of making sure you have enough of those people in place that when the time comes, they're actually going to, proclaim it
Yeah.
to everybody. So
It's exactly right. And one thing I learned, I don't think we did a great job of this with Called to Create. I mean, listen, we had a great launch team for Called to Create. I'm excited for it to be even better for Master of One. And I'm not talking about the people who were in it because the people we got were great. But I think when we were organizing the launch team for Call to Create, I was really concerned with the numbers, right? So not number of people, but like how many social media followers do these people have? Do they have enough to like be in the launch team? It's like it actually doesn't make sense. Like at the end of the day, like everybody is gonna have 150 friends on social media.
yeah,
That's a lot of people, right? Like a relatively large number of people
yeah,
when all you're giving that launch team member is a free advanced copy of the book. If they convert, 5% of their friends, less than that, it's
yeah,
worth it, right?
yeah,
And so I've been thinking a lot less about numbers and a lot more about enthusiasm, right? It's the Chick-fil-A talks a lot about raving fans internally in their corporate culture, right? And I think that's the concept that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the people who are most excited about your work. It's the people that email you after you send out your email newsletter or an announcement about your next book. It's the
yeah,
people that, without any prompting are already sharing your stuff on social media. Like forget about, even if that person only has, 50 Twitter followers, engage that person, thank that person, and ask for their help, right? And be explicit about it. Don't just ask, hey, help me promote my book, but tell them exactly what you want them to do. Hey, I want you to read the book by this date, write a review on Amazon on this date, and share with your friends on this date, right? Like
right.
it's just lead them well, and give explicit calls to actions along the way.
That's awesome. And is that a lot of the stuff that you kind of personally are doing, or is that also part of like the team, or is that kind
Yeah,
of,
my team helps a lot with that. So I do a lot of it personally. So for example, with the launch team, like I will be personally crafting kind of the calendar of communications to that team, right? So when are we reading the book? What deadline am I giving the launch team to read it by? What day are we posting reviews on Amazon, which is obviously day one, right? It's January 21st.
right?
When are we gonna, like, we're doing a huge pre-order campaign for Master of One. We're giving like a really, really big sweepstakes we're doing for the book, which I won't say what it is yet, but it'll be big. It'll be bigger than Call to Create, and Call to Create was like massive. What
For
we
a
gave, it
second,
was
there,
like
I
a
thought I
five.
was going to get the exclusive.
You were gonna get the exclusive. No, not yet. Gotta wait. But yeah, so I'm doing a lot of that personally. I will say I do get my team to help out on managing that launch team. So we manage the launch team via Facebook, private Facebook group, like most authors do. And so I will use my team to monitor that more closely than I can day in, day out when I'm doing interviews and doing all that other stuff. Because a lot of times your launch team will be asking you for stuff like, hey, I'm doing a blog post. I would love, this particular type of photo of the book for the blog post, right? And so my team can like chime in and respond much quicker than I can on that stuff. Yeah, good question.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, I mean, because one of the things too I've talked about a lot on my podcast singularly is having kind of a community around you. I mean, it doesn't have to be like your launch team as in what you're saying, but it's other creatives that are within the same circle that are doing similar things, and they have their own audiences, they have their own platforms, they're also building their own, and how imperative it is to kind of get involved in these clusters so that when something does get launched or something is going to get pushed out, that you kind of have this group that's already kind of
Yeah.
waiting in the wings for it. So
It's critically important. I mean, when I self-published my first book, I set a goal of hitting a couple of Amazon bestseller lists, hitting the number one spot, and even then, I mean, I wouldn't consider that. I didn't call that a launch team at the time. It was 150 of my closest friends and professional allies that I emailed at 8 a.m. or whatever time it was to say, hey, buy the book right now, this second, this out.
Right.
You've got to buy it right now. Right. So yeah, it's the same. It doesn't. I think people think in order to have a launch team, that sounds like such a traditional publishing thing to do, and you gotta have a huge list. Like, not at all. Like, this could be the 10 people you go to church with, or the 20 people you play poker with, like whatever, right? I think we overcomplicate a lot of these things, right?
No,
Like, at the end of the day, it's you're. I mean, again, coming back to this idea of like authors as entrepreneurs, right? Like, I think authors think like book publishing is like so unique. It's not. Like, you're bringing a product to market, and like what matters is finding early adopters who love the product and will share it with others. It's no different than any other product or company, right? Like, it's the same exact thing. Like, find people who are addicts early on and give them more of your stuff, and keep giving them more stuff, and keep thanking them, because they're what's going to drive the success of your business.
I think that's really good. I mean, that's just great. I think in general, Jordan, as a good rule of thumb, just in terms of any kind of interaction that you might be having with anyone, because like you were saying, worrying about the numbers, does this person have 50 followers or do they have 5,000? I mean, the person today who has 50 followers, maybe a year from now could have 5,000. Could be in that position that
Totally.
this person was totally sold out on an idea that you had worked on, and now a year later, here they are. I mean, we don't know, and what you said is more important is the enthusiasm. The fact that
that's exactly right. I've seen that so many times. I'm thinking of a guy right now who, man, this guy, I've been sharing his stuff. He's been following and sharing my stuff for 3 years, and 3 years ago, I think he probably had 30,000 Instagram followers, which was a lot, right? Like, that's a lot to begin with. But today he's lost 400,000 Instagram followers yesterday. This guy's a freaking machine. He's like one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram. His name is Stefan Kuhns, if you're curious. But yeah, I mean, if he signs on with this next book, if he gets excited about Master of One, he'll drive more sales of that book than people that you have heard of. You've never heard of Stefan Kuhns, but the people you have heard of that will endorse the book, they'll probably drive less sales than this guy will, right? And like, it's just being a human being, and like connecting with people early on who are going to drive success, and also just being very generous with them, right? I think there's just a good rule of thumb for authors to be exceedingly generous with their time and how they leverage their platform for others.
For sure.
Over time. So
for sure. It's interesting. I was thinking about how I actually learned about your book, Call to Create, and it was someone that is a part of one of my creative circles had shared it on social media and said, hey, for any of you creatives out there, you're looking for some inspiration, here's a book coming out by someone I've been following for a while. Here you go. Wink, wink. And I looked at it and I started reading the synopsis, and I said, you know what, I need to get this thing. And the timing of my life was good that I was getting it then. Yeah. How as far as like a writer, does timing matter? As far as the idea and as far as getting it out there? Because I think there's also the pressure of, this is a great idea, but man, I got to get this thing out sooner than later, because I think I'm going to miss the boat or something.
That's a really good question. It's hugely important, right? And for some books more so than others. So for example, like politics is like a great example, right? Like, if you're writing, Robert Mueller's The Mueller Report, right? It's like pretty critical to come out now. Like, that's not going to be very relevant after Election Day 2020, right? Right. But no, I mean, even in it's hugely important. Again, as with any business, you can have the best idea in the world. You can have the best team in the world. You can execute near flawlessly, although nobody executes flawlessly. But if the market timing is wrong, it doesn't really matter, right? Like MySpace is a pretty good example. Friendster is a pretty good example. These social networks, pre the ubiquitous smartphone, just couldn't make it, which they may have had they launched post or near 2008 or near 2004 as Facebook is starting to rise with the rise of the smartphone era, right? So I think timing is critically important, and a lot of times what you'll see is once one book comes out on a topic, you can guarantee and does well for the next 5 years, there's going to be a lot of other copycats. And so it's not critical that you're first. I actually don't think that's important. In fact, being first a lot of times is bad. Like you want somebody else to go before you to validate the market, right? But you also don't want to be fifth, right? You want to be somewhere on the cusp of that wave, and that it's really, really. Man, it's really hard to like time that well. And additionally, the traditional publishing world isn't very conducive to being able to ride those market wave timings, right? Because if you see a book today that's doing really well and you decide, oh, I want to ride this wave of this trend, if you started today working on your proposal, working on getting an agent, maybe you have a deal in 6 months and the book doesn't come out for another 12 to 18. That's tough. That is really, really, really tough. So you got to be good at – and honestly, if you're in that situation and it's something super timely, you really should self-publish, right? I personally have become a huge fan of traditional publishing. Which a lot of people think is odd given how entrepreneurial I am, but I actually am a huge fan of publishing partners. But yeah, sometimes it does, like, for example, I had an idea for a book. I actually don't think I'm 99% certain I'm not going to do it. There's still 1% chance I will. I have a concept of a book that really should come out before election day. It's really not about politics, but there's a really, really strong hook kind of with the election. But there's no way I could get that book done with a traditional publisher before, July, when I would want that book to release. So if I do it, it will be self-published, but it's not gonna happen. I'm gonna have to give the idea to somebody else to publish because I don't have the time.
Well, now I'm super intrigued. After all of that, I'm super intrigued, and I'm not trying to plant a seed or anything to say, hey, you got to do this.
You want the concept?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the rough concept. So. And I'm particularly interested in it because I started my career in politics. So one of the few real jobs I ever had, I ran a campaign when I was 17 years old, successful campaign citywide here in Tampa, kind of caught the political bug, stayed on that path for a long time, was in the Bush White House in the Office of Political Affairs. But, as a Christian, the issues that are really important to me, the issue of life, right? I am pro-life, right? Yeah. I think the church's response to these issues for the last few decades, at least, has been, oh, well, if we elect the right person who appoints the right judges, everything else will work itself out. But that's like not how real change historically has happened, right? If you take the abolition movement, you take the anti-slavery movement, right? The anti-slavery movement in the U.S. really started to catch steam when Uncle Tom's Cabin was released and gained wild popularity across the U.S. So there was this groundswell. Hearts and minds started to change. The electorate started to change. And then legislative change followed thereafter, right? Yep. And I actually think that's like a really, really good playbook. So it fits in really well with Called to Create. The way that you bring about significant cultural change is not by legislating it. It's by creating more culture that changes hearts and minds and will eventually lead to legislative change long term. Right. I would even argue this is what the LGBT movement has done. Right. I mean, there's lots of really good long reads about how Hollywood was super intentional about placing gay characters in movies and in TV shows. And, over time, that changed the electorate's mind about these issues and led to legislative change. So I think there's like a really proven playbook there. And I'm so sick and tired of. So I'm not a Republican anymore. I don't know what I am politically. But and a big part of the reason why is I'm so sick and tired of conservatives response to these cultural changes being, well, the only solution is if we have the right Supreme Court justices, we will change the law of the land. That's so naive. It's unbelievably naive.
Yeah.
But listen, I get why politicians peddle it, right? It's a great way to raise money and votes, but it's just not the way that big cultural changes have happened in the past. We do it by writing the next great novel about life. We do it about by making a great movie or building great businesses and nonprofits that are tackling these issues. So
that's really
that's
good.
the concept.
No, that's really cool. It's the boots on the ground thinking that is truly where it comes down to. I mean, the idea of creating culture, changing it is a boots on the ground, ideas generating, sharing them. That was way more than I thought you'd give me, actually. So I'm really
so this is the book that there's like almost a 0% chance that I'll write. If you love it, you right away, and maybe I'll consider it. The only format I've thought about is it's like literally a pamphlet, right? It's almost like the Federalist Papers and like Hamilton, right? Like literally a pamphlet that we circulate, across the country. I don't think you can even call it a book, but yeah, it's interesting. Yeah,
that's awesome.
It's like an essay, I guess.
There you go. I'll look for it, Jordan, in the coming days. I will look for it, or months, I should say. I'll look for it in the coming months. We'll see how that goes. That was great, man. So shifting gears a little bit here, I wanted to talk a little bit more about Call to Create specifically, and about how we've talked about entrepreneurship, we've talked about the writing process, and just a little bit about failure and whatnot. How do we overcome our fears? Like, what would be some good ways of, kind of overcoming those fears, like rejection, or that, I'm not going to get this idea out in time, things like that. Because I think you made some good points in the book about overcoming fear in general, that I did want to touch on, because I think that also bleeds into just writing in general, and just the idea of, like, I think, it was Hemingway who has the quote of, writing is simple. You just sit down at a typewriter and bleed. So knowing that there's so much gusto of a person that's going into this work, there is a lot of like, oh no, potential backlash that I don't know if I can weather that storm, So.
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question. I'll give a couple of tips. Two very practical. One, you can take it or leave it and decide whether or not it's practical for you. The first is, I've already touched on it, just discipline, right? I think you overcome fear by practicing a lot and just getting in the habit of facing those fears, right? And sitting down at your laptop every day. So for me, like when I'm writing, it's usually my first 90-minute block of the day. I break my day into big chunks of 90-minute blocks of time, right? And so typically it's my first 90 minute of the block of the day. I sit down and I write, right? With zero distractions, zero push notifications. I just crank away, right? So I think that's a good way of overcoming fear, is just getting the practice of confronting that fear. Secondly, I think another way to do it is, I think a lot of times for writers, the fear for the writer is fear of rejection. And I think it's because a lot of writers will write an entire book before they get any feedback on it, right? And yeah, I would be scared of that too. That's like a terrifying prospect. And so, I give more advice to nonfiction writers than fiction writers because I don't understand fiction at all. I read very little of it, actually. But for nonfiction writers, like that's the easiest thing to get rapid feedback on. So Master of One is about how to master anything that you've chosen to really sink your teeth into. And one of the best principles of mastery is rapid and deliberate feedback, right? So every time you write a chapter, get feedback on it immediately. Even before you start writing the book, get feedback on it, right? So for Master of One, it was actually before it was Master of One, I had this other concept for the book that was kind of similar. So I basically had two book proposals. And I sent it out to 50 of my most loyal readers to my weekly newsletter. And I was like, hey, one, is this a book worth writing? And two, if so, which of these two paths do I take? Right. So getting feedback just early and often, I think helps assuage a lot of that fear. Right. Because if you're, 50,000 words in and you haven't got any feedback, I would be terrified too. The third, and again, this, you could debate how practical this is, but, as a Christian, my ultimate way of fighting fear is recognizing that My career as an author, my career as an entrepreneur, and my relative success in those endeavors does not define who I am.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really, really, really hard thing to grasp
Yeah.
as a writer whose name is on the cover of a book. It's very easy
Hmm.
to equate the success of the book with your worth and your value as a person. We all want to be successful. That's a good thing. I think it's a really good thing. It makes us ambitious. I think ambition is a good thing. But when your identity and your very sense of who you are is attached to the success or failure
Yeah.
of your next book or of your next venture, failure is devastating because it is a referendum not just on the product or the project, but on who you are as an individual.
Oh
And
yeah.
as a Christian, and I have wrestled with that. I really, really wrestled with that throughout my career. And I have I have found that the only definitive answer to that problem is who Jesus Christ says I am. So, as a Christian, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. He came to earth and died for me. That and says that I am a child of God if I believe in Him. That's radical, and that identity outweighs anything else that the world might say I am as an author. So, for those of you who are not Christians, you could totally tune out everything I just said. But honestly, I would encourage you not to. Like,
Right.
I think this is a big problem for everybody. I think if we're really honest, we all struggle with this idea of where we find our worth, and finding it in what we do is like the least secure thing in the world. That
Yeah.
is
Exactly.
not a stable way to live your life and build your sense of worth and identity. So if it's Christianity, great. If it's something else, I would encourage you to find something. I would argue that Christianity is the only solid thing that you can really take to the bank.
Hmm.
But find something more solid than your work to build your identity on.
No, that's really good. That's really good. I mean, I can definitely resonate with that. Just the idea of my name is on a book, and that's me out there. That's not Jesus's name necessarily.
Yeah,
It's my name, and that's going to
right.
be open to scrutiny. It's going
Exactly
to be
right.
open. It's going to be open to feedback. It's going to be open to all kinds of critique, all those kinds of things. So there is a layer of personal. You could take it personally, basically.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
That can that can kind of hinder that pursuit.
Sure.
And I wanted to say too that one of the things that, and keeping on this theme, I think in the church,
Yeah.
is one of the things, and I don't know if you paraphrase it in the book or not, but you were talking about this divide between the pulpit and the pews,
Yeah.
and this idea out there that the greatest thing we can ever do as sort of Christian entrepreneurs is to one day be a pastor or plant a church and speak to the masses every Sunday, things like that, and totally poking a hole in that kind of ideology and saying
Yeah.
no, actually the greatest thing that I can do is what God wants me to do,
Yeah.
which could be start a business, it could be
Yeah.
working at XYZ company, it could be writing for the rest of my life or whatever it is.
Yeah.
I thought that was really something that I hadn't really seen put in that perspective
Yeah.
quite yet, which
Sure.
which also was very glaring to me in some sense because I went,
Yeah.
why haven't I heard this before?
Right. Right. Right.
What?
You had the
So
same response a lot of readers did.
yeah.
Yeah. I think this is a struggle for Christians and non-Christians.
Mhm.
I think all of us get this message of like, okay, if we really want to do something meaningful with our lives, business can't be the answer. You'll go work for an NGO, or you'll
Yeah.
go, start a nonprofit in your hometown, or, go volunteer in feeding the homeless.
Mhm.
And those are good things. Those are things I think we should be doing. I think we should be encouraging.
Mhm.
But I think we're really like kidding ourselves if we don't think that our work as authors is meaningful. Like Jesus talks a lot about loving your neighbor as yourself. What does that mean, right? Like loving your neighbor as yourself as a writer means
Mhm.
just writing the best book you possibly can because you like good books. C.S. Lewis said this all the time. He said, we do not need more Christian books. We need more Christians writing good books. I
Yes.
couldn't agree more, right? There's this coffee shop right around the corner from my house that I go to because it's the only game in town, but I actually hate it because it's like so glaringly quote unquote Christian. You literally walk in and there's a huge mural on the wall with a Bible verse painted on it. And if I wasn't a Christian, I would feel so uncomfortable there. And it makes me angry because, the coffee is good and the service is good and the place is beautiful. And I'm just like, just be that. Just make the best cup of coffee you possibly can. That is loving your neighbor as yourself. And if that brings about opportunities to share more deeply who you are, great. But if not, that's okay too. Love your neighbor as yourself was a complete sentence. Jesus did not say love your neighbor as yourself so that you could tell people about me. He just said love your neighbor as yourself. Period. Full stop. Right. I just, I think a lot of times we think that the only way that we can have meaningful work is if we are constantly talking about the why behind what we do or constantly serving the poor. And I just don't think that's true. I think we serve people really well when we write great books and we create great businesses and create great products. That serves people well. So.
And I think that's all really good as well. I think it all comes down to a lot of the heart posture, the motivation, like what is the motivation behind what I'm doing?
Yeah.
So as far as what you were saying, putting together all these different stories and interviews that you had and then saying, okay, this could actually be a good book now.
Yeah.
There may have not even been, I mean, probably there was, but as far as the vision that was overarching everything, now the motivation is I could share this with people and people could really take something from this.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly right. And I think that's the only sustainable motivation for our work. Like if I had said, oh man, this is a way for me to make money, which all you authors are laughing because there's very little money in directly in writing books. But that would have been very, very short-sighted, right? I mean, I could have made, good beer money in the short term in the launch of Call to Create, but it's not near the impact for me personally and the gratification for me personally, having people like you, Josh, come to me 18 months after this book's been on shelves and say, hey, this book had a big impact on my life. Like that's so much more valuable and rewarding than any, financial gain that I had from that book. So
that's great, man. That's great. Speaking of profit, I mean, you have a chapter in the book called The Purpose of Profit.
Sure.
And you're literally talking about, what do we do with our money as we're going through these ventures, like what are we supposed to do with them? And I kind of wanted to talk on that a little bit because, as an author, like you were saying, the money that's out there to make, I mean, there's almost like a quick gradient, like those that can get very successful very quickly. Sure. And those that are kind of teetering, and trying to get into that space. What do we do with ourselves then when we do become profitable? Like what are the things that we do with those profits that will feed back?
Yeah, I'll make this quick because I'm running out of time. But I think I think a lot of times we think that, especially this is spoken a lot in the church, right? That the only honorable use of profits is to give it away. Yeah. I think that's really small thinking. I think that is a good use of profits, right? But I think if you're really ambitious for your business as a writer, right, and you really believe that you're serving others through your work, then a really good use of profit is reinvesting it back into your business, right, so that you can grow and so that you can bring the next book to market and reach even more people and use that money for advertising or marketing or pay your employees more or whatever it might be. I mean, I think, again, Arthur Guinness, I think, is a really good example. Go read up on Guinness and how he treated his employees. He's a remarkable example. He gave away a lot of his wealth, but he also reinvested in his company and served his employees really well in the process. So, yeah, I think I talk more about this in Call to Create, but I think just looking at profit as simplistically as, oh, I should give it away is really missing the mark in a lot of different ways. So, that's good, hopefully that's helpful. Yeah.
No, that's great. That's great, Jordan. Really appreciate this conversation, man.
Yeah, this is fun.
Yeah,
happy to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the book is Called to Create. The next book, though, which will be Master of One, set to come out January 21st.
Yeah, January 21st, 2020.
2020. And as I understand, there's going to be some sweepstakes and other cool things that will be surrounding it. Where should we go to find you then?
Sure. Yeah, very simple. JordanRaynor.com, JordanRaynor.com. You can sign up for my weekly emails. You can check out Master of One and Call to Create there. And connect with me, shoot me a message if you really want me to write that book that I'm probably not going to write. And yeah,
I know. I was
would
gonna
love
say,
would love to meet all of you.
a lot of people might email you now and say, "Hey,
Yeah, exactly.
I really want to hear that political book that you want to write
Mhm.
about." So
Yeah.
awesome. Well, thank you again, Jordan. This was an absolute pleasure, man. Good luck
Thank
to you,
you,
man.
Josh. Appreciate it.